"Step out of the car now." Officer Liam Parker barked, his voice cutting through the stillness of the parking lot like a whip. Across from him stood Evelyn Moore, her stance calm yet firm, dressed in plain clothes and standing beside her unmarked patrol car. She carried an authority that belied her casual appearance. "I'm authorized to be here," she said, her voice steady. But Parker wasn't listening. His hand rested on his holster. A silent threat. "Don't argue with me. Step back, or I'll make you," he snarled. The hostility was thick in the air, clinging to Evelyn like an insult. Raising her hand, she tried to de-escalate the tension. "You don't want to do this. Just let me." Before she could finish, Parker moved, quick, aggressive. His shove sent her stumbling against the car. "People like you don't belong here," he sneered. Her breath hitched. "People like you." The phrase burned hotter than the ache in her back as she straightened herself, brushing dust off her jacket. "What did you just say?" Evelyn asked, locking eyes with him. "I said you don't belong here. Now leave before I have to call backup." His sneer was laced with condescension, his posture screaming arrogance, a misplaced authority he thought was unshakable. But then Evelyn did something that stopped him cold. Slowly, she reached into her pocket. Parker flinched, his hand flying toward his weapon. But she wasn't pulling out a weapon. No, it was far worse for him. It was her badge. His eyes widened as he stared at the shiny emblem in her hand. Chief of Police. The color drained from his face. For a moment, he couldn't speak, couldn't move. All he could do was process the reality. He had just shoved his superior. Evelyn stepped closer, her voice calm but icy. "Let me explain something to you. I don't answer to you. In fact, you answer to me." The silence that followed was deafening. Parker fumbled for words, stammering incoherent excuses. But Evelyn wasn't finished. "Do you even know who I am?" she asked, her tone sharp enough to cut through steel. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He was choking on his own arrogance, on the weight of what had just unraveled. What followed that night set off a chain reaction no one saw coming. Parker's fate and Evelyn's would intertwine in ways neither could have predicted. The humiliation Parker had dished out so easily was about to become his downfall, but not in the way anyone expected. The morning after the incident, the precinct was unusually quiet. A thick, unspoken tension rippled through the department. Evelyn sat in her office, her fingers pressed against her temples as she read through the report she had demanded from Internal Affairs. Sleep had been a fleeting notion the night before. Every detail of Parker's arrogance replayed in her mind like an endless loop. Her office door creaked open, and Deputy Chief Nathan Martinez stepped in, his face tight with concern. "Chief," he began carefully, "we've got a situation brewing. Parker knows what's coming. He's already talking to some of the officers in his circle, trying to rally support." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Support for what?" "He violated every protocol in the book. There's no defense for what he did." Nathan hesitated. "It's not about defense. It's about loyalty. Some of the old guard, they don't see you as one of them. They'll frame this as you being too harsh, too political." Evelyn smirked, though there was no humor in it. "Too harsh? He assaulted his superior officer without cause. If I were a man, they'd be falling over themselves to condemn him. This isn't about loyalty, Nathan. It's about fear of change." Nathan nodded but didn't say more. He knew she was right. He also knew how stubborn the old guard could be. "The review panel meets in 3 days. Do you want me to take the lead on this?" Nathan offered. "No," Evelyn replied firmly. "This is mine to handle. Parker needs to know that actions have consequences, not just for him, but for everyone who thinks they can operate above the rules." In the locker room, Parker paced like a caged animal. A few officers lingered nearby, their faces a mix of discomfort and complicity. Officer Ben Carver, one of Parker's closest allies, leaned against a bench, watching him carefully. "You're blowing this out of proportion, Parker," Ben said, trying to sound reassuring. "It's not like you knew she was the chief." "That's not the point," Parker snapped, his voice filled with frustration. "She's going to make an example out of me. Do you know what that'll do to my career? My pension? Ben shrugged. Maybe just apologize. Say it was a misunderstanding. That usually works. Parker stopped pacing and turned to Ben, his eyes blazing. You think this is about an apology? She wants to humiliate me. I'm not going to let her win. Back in her office, Evelyn reviewed the footage from the parking lot. It was as damning as she remembered. Parker's aggressive posture, his refusal to listen, the shove, it was all there. Crystal clear. But what lingered in her mind was something else. The look in his eyes. Not respect, not even caution, but disdain. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. Nathan stepped in again, this time looking more concerned. Chief, there's chatter. Parker's talking about filing a grievance, claiming you're targeting him because of… Nathan trailed off. Because of what? Evelyn pressed. Nathan hesitated. Because of race. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. He's pulling that card? Nathan nodded grimly. It's desperate, but it might stick with some of the guys who already don't like how you're running things. Evelyn sighed, standing up and crossing her arms. Let him dig himself deeper. The facts are on my side, and the footage doesn't lie. If he wants to turn this into a public spectacle, I'll be ready. But the public spectacle was already beginning to brew. By the next day, whispers about the incident had spread beyond the department. Union representatives were asking questions, and some officers were visibly choosing sides. Later that evening, Evelyn walked into the precinct's main floor. Conversations hushed as she stepped up to address her team. I'm sure you've all heard about the incident in the parking lot, she began, her voice steady but firm. I won't go into details, because this matter is under review. But let me make one thing clear. Accountability applies to everyone, no matter their rank, tenure, or reputation. Our job is to serve and protect, and that starts with respecting each other and the community we serve. If anyone has an issue with that, my office door is open. Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Parker stood at the back of the room, his jaw tight as he listened. After the meeting, Ben approached Parker, his tone more cautious this time. She's not backing down. Parker, maybe you should. No, Parker interrupted, his voice low but seething. She wants to humiliate me. I'm not going to let her win. What Parker didn't realize was that Evelyn wasn't interested in humiliating him. She was interested in exposing a culture that allowed people like him to thrive unchecked. And as the days passed, she began to see just how deep the rot went. The review panel convened in a tense, crowded room. Evelyn sat at one end of the table, her posture composed but unyielding. Parker sat at the other, flanked by his union representative. The proceedings were grueling, filled with half-truths and misdirection from Parker's defense. But Evelyn held her ground, presenting the footage, the reports, and testimonials of other officers who had witnessed Parker's behavior firsthand. This isn't about me or you, she said, her voice steady but piercing. This is about what kind of department we want to be. Do we want to uphold the values we claim to stand for? Or do we want to protect those who tarnish them? The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in, but the fight was far from over. The days that followed were filled with fallout. Parker's supporters grew quieter as more evidence against him came to light. Evelyn continued to push for reforms, knowing the road ahead would be long and fraught with resistance. But she also knew it was worth it. As she stood in her office one evening, looking out over the city, she allowed herself a moment of hope. The truth was out, and while the battle was far from over, the path forward was finally within reach.